June 18, 1952. Malcolm's Hardware Store, 125th Street, Harlem. A white store owner named Gerald Malcolm made a decision that would cost him everything he owned. He refused to sell a single hammer to Bumpy Johnson. 9 hours later, his store was completely empty. Not robbed. Not burned. Just empty. Every shelf. Every product. Gone. And what happened in those 9 hours became the stuff of legend. 347 people witnessed what happened next. But before we get to that, you need to understand who Bumpy Johnson really was. This wasn't just some street criminal. This was the man who controlled every corner, every deal, every business decision in Harlem. When Bumpy walked down the street, people didn't just move aside. They bowed. Store owners gave him discounts without being asked. Police officers looked the other way. And anyone who disrespected him learned a lesson they never forgot. That morning started like any other. Bumpy needed a hammer to fix a loose board in his apartment. Simple enough. He walked into Malcolm's hardware store at exactly 9:47 a.m. The bell above the door rang. Gerald Malcolm looked up from behind his counter. His face went pale. He knew exactly who just walked in. Everyone in Harlem knew Bumpy Johnson. If you want the full truth about what really happened that day, hit like so this story reaches more people who need to hear it. Bumpy approached the counter. No attitude. No threats. Just a simple request. He needed a hammer. Gerald Malcolm stared at him for exactly 12 seconds. Then he said 6 words that changed everything. "We don't serve your kind here." The store went silent. Dead silent. 2 other customers froze in place. A woman holding paint cans actually gasped. Because everyone knew what those words meant. In 1952 Harlem, you could be racist. Plenty of white store owners were. But you didn't say it to Bumpy Johnson's face. You just didn't. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. Didn't threaten. Didn't even look angry. He just smiled. That smile terrified people more than any gun ever could. He nodded slowly, turned around, and walked out of the store. The bell rang again as the door closed. Gerald Malcolm felt relieved. He actually felt like he won something. Like he stood his ground. He had no idea what was coming. Bumpy walked exactly 43 steps to a payphone on the corner. He made one phone call. It lasted 90 seconds. Then he walked home. That single phone call set everything in motion. Within 20 minutes, word spread through Harlem like wildfire. Bumpy Johnson had been disrespected. The man who protected Harlem's businesses. The man who made sure white cops didn't harass black shop owners. The man who kept the Italian mob from taking over their neighborhood. He had been called a slur and refused service. Comment respect if you believe the community had every right to respond. Now here's where the story gets interesting. Bumpy didn't organize what happened next. He didn't have to. That's what power really looks like. Real power isn't forcing people to do what you want. Real power is when people act on your behalf without being asked. And the people of Harlem understood exactly what needed to happen. At 10:30 a.m., Mrs. Eleanor Washington walked into Malcolm's hardware store. She was a 72-year-old grandmother who had been shopping there for 15 years. She asked Gerald how much she owed on her account. He told her $83. She paid it in full. Then she said something that made his stomach drop. "I won't be needing your services anymore, Mr. Malcolm." She walked out. Gerald figured she was just one customer. He could handle losing one customer. At 11:15 a.m., Reverend Thomas Clay came in. He had a standing monthly order. $200 worth of supplies for church repairs. He canceled it. Just like that. No explanation. He just said he found a new supplier and left. Gerald started getting nervous. But he convinced himself it was just a coincidence. 2 people leaving didn't mean anything. By noon, 17 more customers had come in. Every single one paid their debts and left. Not angrily. Not making threats. They were almost polite about it. But the message was crystal clear. You disrespect Bumpy Johnson, you lose Harlem. And losing Harlem meant losing everything. At 1 p.m., Gerald's main supplier called. A black-owned warehouse company that provided 60% of his inventory. They were ending their contract immediately. No negotiation. No explanation needed. Gerald tried to argue. tried to offer more money. The man on the phone just said, "We know what you said to Mr. Johnson," and hung up. That's when Gerald Malcolm realized he made a catastrophic mistake. Type yes if you want to see how the entire community came together. At 2 p.m., something happened that Gerald never expected. His white customers started canceling orders too. Not because they cared about racism, but because they understood business. If you can't get inventory, you can't run a store. If the whole neighborhood turns on you, you're finished. White folks in Harlem knew they needed the black community a lot more than the black community needed them. Supporting Gerald Malcolm meant bad business. And business always comes first. But it gets better. At 3 p.m., Gerald got a visit from 3 Italian men in expensive suits. They weren't there to help him. They were there to collect. See, Gerald didn't own that building. He rented it from a company connected to the Italian mob. And those mobsters had a very profitable arrangement with Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy kept Harlem peaceful. Harlem staying peaceful meant their businesses made money. Gerald Malcolm threatening that peace was bad for everyone. The men told Gerald his rent was increasing. Effective immediately. From $800 a month to $3,000 a month. Gerald's jaw dropped. He tried to negotiate. They didn't even pretend to listen. One of them lit a cigarette and said something Gerald would never forget. "Mr. Johnson keeps this neighborhood calm. You made things not calm. That costs us money. Now it costs you money." They walked out. Gerald realized even the white power structure wouldn't protect him. Because Bumpy Johnson was more valuable to them than he was. At 4 p.m., Gerald Malcolm did something desperate. He called the police. He demanded protection. He demanded they arrest people for intimidation. The officer who answered actually laughed. Not cruelly. Almost sympathetically. Like he felt sorry for how stupid Gerald was. The officer explained something very carefully. "Mr. Malcolm, nobody threatened you. Nobody damaged your property. People just stopped shopping at your store. That's called freedom of choice. We can't arrest people for choosing not to shop somewhere." Then the officer hung up. Share this video so more people understand how real community power works. By 5 p.m., Gerald's store was a ghost town. Not a single customer had walked in for 3 hours. His phone kept ringing, but it was only suppliers canceling contracts and vendors demanding immediate payment for outstanding debts. He sat behind his counter, staring at shelves full of hammers and nails and paint and tools that nobody wanted anymore. Not because the products were bad. Because he made an enemy he couldn't afford to make. At 6 p.m., something happened that broke Gerald completely. His own employees quit. All 4 of them. They were white. They had worked for him for years. But they understood reality. Working for a man who disrespected Bumpy Johnson meant becoming unemployable in Harlem. Their families lived in Harlem. Their kids went to school in Harlem. They shopped in Harlem. Supporting Gerald meant destroying their own lives. So they walked out. Politely. Professionally. But permanently. Now here's the part that became legend. At 6:47 p.m., exactly 9 hours after Bumpy walked out of that store, something extraordinary happened. Bumpy Johnson walked back in. The bell rang. Gerald Malcolm looked up, and his eyes were red from crying. His store was empty of customers. Empty of employees. About to be empty of inventory because he couldn't pay suppliers. And Bumpy Johnson stood there, calm as ever, holding a $100 bill. Gerald's hands were shaking. He didn't know what to expect. Violence? Humiliation? More punishment? But Bumpy just smiled that same terrifying smile and said something Gerald Malcolm would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. "I'd like to buy a hammer, please." Gerald couldn't speak. He just nodded, grabbed a hammer from the shelf, and handed it to Bumpy. Bumpy placed the $100 bill on the counter. The hammer cost $3.45. Bumpy didn't wait for change. He took the hammer and started walking toward the door. If this shocked you, comment legend below. Then Bumpy stopped, turned around, and said something that explained everything. "You know what the difference is between me and you, Mr. Malcolm? You thought you had power because you owned a store. I have power because I serve my community. You take from Harlem. I protect Harlem. So when you disrespected me, you didn't just disrespect one man. You disrespected everyone I've ever helped. Everyone I've ever protected. Everyone who depends on me to keep them safe from people exactly like you. That's why your store is empty. Not because I told them to leave, but because they chose to leave. Because they understand something you never will. Real power isn't about control. It's about earning respect so deep that people defend you without being asked. Bumpy walked out. The bell rang one final time. Gerald Malcolm stood there, holding $96.55 in change that would never be collected. That was Thursday evening. By Saturday morning, Gerald Malcolm closed his store permanently. He left Harlem and never came back. The building sat empty for exactly 3 weeks. Then something beautiful happened. A black entrepreneur named James Cooper bought the property. He opened Cooper's Hardware. Same location, same products, but different owner, different energy, different respect for the community. And Bumpy Johnson was his very first customer. Bought the exact same hammer. Paid the exact same $3.45. But this time he smiled for real. Not that terrifying smile. A genuine smile. Because this was how it was supposed to be. Black businesses thriving in a black neighborhood. Serving their own people. Building their own wealth. Cooper's Hardware stayed in business for 43 years. It became an institution in Harlem. James Cooper's son ran it after he retired. His grandson runs it today. And on the wall, behind the counter, there's a framed photograph. It shows Bumpy Johnson shaking hands with James Cooper on opening day. Under the photo, there's a small plaque. It says, "The first hammer sold in this store was bought by the man who made this store possible. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for showing us that real power comes from community." Type community if you believe this is how justice should work. But the story doesn't end there. Because what happened to Gerald Malcolm became a warning that echoed through Harlem for generations. White business owners learned a lesson. You can operate in a black neighborhood. You can make money in a black neighborhood. But you cannot disrespect the people who live there. You cannot treat them as less than human and expect to survive. Because the black community had something more powerful than weapons. They had unity. They had economic power. And they had Bumpy Johnson. The Italian mob learned something too. They realized Bumpy wasn't just muscle. He was a community organizer. He controlled Harlem not through fear, but through genuine respect and protection. When the mob tried to move drugs into Harlem schools, Bumpy shut it down. When they tried to force black businesses to pay protection money, Bumpy made it clear that he was the only protection Harlem needed. And after what happened to Gerald Malcolm, the mob understood. Fighting Bumpy Johnson meant fighting all of Harlem. And nobody wins that fight. Even the police learned their lesson. They realized that Bumpy Johnson kept the peace better than they ever could. Crime in Bumpy's territory was lower than anywhere else in New York. Not because people feared arrest, but because people respected the code. You don't steal from your neighbors. You don't hurt your community. You protect your own. And if you break that code, you don't answer to police. You answer to Bumpy, which was infinitely worse. Now let's talk about why this story matters today. Because this wasn't just about one hardware store. This was about economic power. This was about showing that communities can defend themselves without violence, without riots, without destruction, just with unity. When Gerald Malcolm refused to serve Bumpy Johnson, the community didn't burn down his store. They didn't loot it. They didn't vandalize it. They simply chose to shop elsewhere. They chose to support their own. And that choice was more powerful than any act of violence could ever be. Share this video so communities everywhere understand what was really possible. This is the part they don't teach in history books. They talk about the civil rights movement. They talk about protests and marches. But they don't talk about the quiet economic revolutions that happened every single day in places like Harlem. They don't talk about how black communities built their own power structures. How they protected their own interests. How they made it clear that disrespect would not be tolerated. Not through violence, but through unity and economic action. Bumpy Johnson understood something that most people miss. He understood that respect isn't demanded. It's earned. He earned it by protecting Harlem. By making sure black businesses could thrive. By keeping white criminals and corrupt cops out of black neighborhoods. by standing up to the Italian mob when they tried to exploit his community. And when Gerald Malcolm disrespected him, the community defended him. Not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. Because Bumpy had proven, time and time again, that he would protect them. So they protected him right back. The lesson here is simple but powerful. Individual racism can't survive community unity. Gerald Malcolm was racist. Plenty of people were racist in 1952. But when an entire community says no, when an entire community withdraws their economic support, racism becomes financially unsustainable. Gerald learned that the hard way. He thought he could be racist and still make money. He was wrong. Dead wrong. And here's the beautiful irony. Bumpy Johnson, the man they called a criminal, did more for economic justice in Harlem than most civil rights leaders. Not with speeches, not with legislation, but with action. By showing that the black dollar had power. By proving that unity was stronger than hate. By demonstrating that communities could police themselves and defend their own interests without waiting for the government to save them. If you believe this is the kind of power communities need today, comment unity below. Today, we talk about boycotts like there's something new. Cancel culture. Social media campaigns. But Bumpy Johnson was doing this in 1952. No Twitter. No Facebook. Just word of mouth. Just community trust. Just people understanding that their collective power was stronger than any individual business owner's bigotry. Gerald Malcolm learned that lesson in 9 hours. 9 hours that destroyed everything he built. Not through violence. Not through crime. Just through choice. The choice of free people to support businesses that respect them and abandon businesses that don't. So what happened to Bumpy Johnson after this? He continued controlling Harlem for another 16 years. He worked with Malcolm X. He mentored young men who would become the next generation of black leaders. He made sure his community stayed strong, stayed unified, stayed protected. And when he died in 1968, 10,000 people attended his funeral. 10,000 people came to pay respects to a man that the government called a criminal. Because those 10,000 people knew the truth. Bumpy Johnson was more than a gangster. He was a protector, a provider, a man who showed them that power doesn't come from a badge or a business license. Power comes from community. And Gerald Malcolm? He disappeared from history. Nobody remembers his name except as a cautionary tale. A man who learned too late that in a community as tight as Harlem, disrespecting the wrong person doesn't just cost you a customer. It costs you everything. The hammer Bumpy bought that day? Legend says James Cooper kept it in his office until the day he died. Never sold it. Never used it. Just kept it as a reminder. A reminder that the first sale in his store came from the man who made his dream possible. The man who proved that black economic power was real. The man who showed an entire community that they didn't have to accept disrespect. They could choose dignity. They could choose unity. They could choose to support their own. Before we end, let me leave you with this. Hit the like button if this story opened your eyes. Comment which part shocked you most. And subscribe because there are hundreds more stories like this. Stories they don't teach in schools. Stories about real people who built real power in their communities. Stories that prove change doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it comes from the streets up. Sometimes it comes from one man making one phone call. And sometimes it comes from a community understanding that together, they're unstoppable. Because you can't destroy one man when 40,000 stand behind him. And you definitely can't sell hammers when 40,000 people refuse to buy them.